In a world where every action can spark controversy, where a single moment can change the course of someone's life forever, this story begins with a dramatic twist, one that no one saw coming. A black woman, just minding her own business, is suddenly handcuffed by the police. The scene looks like something straight out of a movie, but it's real. The tension in the air is thick, and the officers are certain they've got the right person. Yet little do they know, this woman isn't just any ordinary citizen. She's got a phone call to make, a phone call that will turn the entire situation upside down. The stakes? Nothing short of a battle of power and fate. But that's not the only surprising twist in this story. Over on a crowded bus, a young black teen, just a few years into his own life's journey, makes a simple yet powerful gesture, a gesture that will alter his destiny in ways he could never have imagined. When a pregnant white woman steps onto the bus, weary and struggling with her pregnancy, the young teen offers her a seat. A small act of kindness, one that is rare but always needed. The woman, grateful for his compassion, hands him a note before she leaves the bus. The note? It holds a secret that could change everything for him, his life, his future, all wrapped up in a few simple words. Now, you might think these two stories are separate, that they don't intersect, that they're merely two unrelated incidents in a world full of them. But what if I told you these stories aren't as different as they seem? What if I told you that these two moments of chance, these seemingly random acts, would weave together in a way that no one, not even the people involved, could ever have predicted? The woman handcuffed by the police? Her phone call reaches someone so high up, so powerful, that the Pentagon itself steps in. And suddenly, the officers who thought they had control over the situation find themselves facing consequences they never saw coming. The tables are turned in a way that leaves the officers stunned, and everyone watching in disbelief. But who is this woman, and what does she know that can make such powerful figures in the government and military scramble to intervene? Meanwhile, the young teen, sitting with the note in his hands, begins to realize the weight of what he's holding. The message is more than just a thank you, it's a key to an opportunity he never dreamed possible. It's a life-changing moment. A reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the biggest transformations. But just as the story begins to unfold, things take a turn. The woman who made the phone call, the teen with the note, are their paths about to cross? What will happen when these two worlds collide? And how will the authorities respond when they realize they've underestimated the very people they thought they could control? Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. The truth is stranger than fiction, and the twists are just getting started. Don't blink, you won't want to miss what happens next. The air was heavy with uncertainty as the police officers stood there, their hands on their cuffs, eyes darting between each other and the woman who had been handcuffed in front of them. She had done nothing wrong. At least, that's what anyone who had watched the scene unfold would have believed. But somehow, she found herself the center of attention, surrounded by flashing lights and the sharp voices of law enforcement. Her name was Lila Roberts, a woman whose life had always been in the background, never in the spotlight. She didn't seek attention. She just wanted to live her life quietly. But now, that life was being interrupted, her dignity put on display for the world to see. Lila had always known the risks of living in a society where she was often viewed through the lens of her skin color. But this moment, this very public moment, felt different. Something was wrong, and she could feel it in her bones. Her heart pounded in her chest, not just out of fear of what might happen next, but because deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The officers were questioning her, asking why she was walking down this particular street at this particular time, as if it could justify the harshness of the situation. They had no real reason to detain her. It was as simple as that. But Lila, with a calm resolve that came from years of enduring injustices, remained silent. As the officers began to grow impatient, one of them pulled out his phone to call for backup. It was then that Lila did something unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her own phone, pressing a number she knew by heart. It wasn't a number that most people would have in their contacts. It was the number of someone high up, someone whose name sent shivers through the corridors of power. She didn't hesitate. She dialed. The call was brief, just a few words spoken, but those words were enough. Lila didn't need to explain herself further. The moment the phone call ended, the atmosphere around her shifted. The officers who had been so confident in their control started to look nervous. The backup they had called for seemed to stall, and there was a sudden shift in how the situation was being handled. Lila's phone call had set something in motion, something far bigger than anyone in the immediate vicinity could comprehend. The Pentagon had just been informed, and things were about to change for everyone involved. Meanwhile, far away from this escalating situation, a different kind of drama was unfolding on a crowded city bus. Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old high school student, was exhausted after a long day of classes. His mind was still racing with thoughts about an upcoming exam, and he was more focused on his math homework than anything happening around him. The bus was packed, the air stuffy with the heat of a busy afternoon, and Marcus had taken his usual spot near the back, his bag resting on the empty seat beside him. As the bus made its way through the city streets, a pregnant woman boarded. She looked weary, her face pale, and her hand rested protectively on her stomach. It was clear she had been on her feet for far too long. Without thinking, Marcus stood up and offered her a seat. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled, a soft smile of gratitude that made Marcus feel like he had done something important, even though it was such a simple gesture. She sat down, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in her gaze, something that made Marcus feel like he had just done more than give up a seat. As the bus continued its journey, the woman prepared to get off at her stop. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of paper. Without saying much, she handed it to Marcus. The note was simple, just a few words, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate.
It read, "You've got a future. Keep going.
I see potential in you. You're not alone." At first, Marcus didn't quite understand. He thought it might just be a random act of kindness, perhaps something the woman did to thank him. But something about the note felt different, as though it held more significance than a simple thank you. He tucked it into his pocket, unsure of what to make of it but feeling that, somehow, it was important. Neither Marcus nor Lila knew that their worlds were about to collide in a way that no one could predict. The day started like any other, but as these two individuals, seemingly so far apart in their circumstances, found themselves entangled in events that were larger than life itself, the ripple effect of their actions would be felt across the city and beyond. Back with Lila, the situation had escalated quickly. The officers, once so confident in their position, were now scrambling to figure out what was going on. They could feel the weight of their mistake, but they didn't know how to undo it. Their radios crackled with orders, the tone suddenly much more serious. Whatever had just happened, whatever call Lila had made, was now in motion. It wasn't just the local authorities anymore, it was something far bigger, something that would soon reach the highest levels of power. The officers tried to maintain control, but the air was electric with a sense of urgency. Lila stood there, still calm, almost eerily so. She knew exactly what was coming. She had made her call, and now it was a matter of waiting. The last few moments before the Pentagon's intervention felt like an eternity. The officers, for all their training, had never been in a situation like this before. They were out of their depth, and the realization was sinking in that they had made a terrible mistake. They had underestimated the woman they had handcuffed. But even as the tension grew, there was something else in the air, a deeper mystery that had yet to unfold. Who was Lila, really? How did she have access to such power? Why had she been in the wrong place at the wrong time? The truth was, there were layers to Lila's story that no one, not even the police officers, could have understood. And what about Marcus? What was it about the woman's note that made him feel like he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a bus ride? He didn't know it yet, but his decision to give up his seat had started a chain reaction. That small act of kindness would soon lead him to a place he never imagined, and the impact of that note would ripple through his life in ways that were impossible to predict. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The stories of Lila and Marcus were far from over. Lila sat there, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, but She didn't flinch. Her mind was 1,000 miles away from the chaotic scene unfolding around her. She had learned long ago how to stay composed, how to appear calm in the face of hostility. But inside, a storm was brewing. She had made the call, and now all she had to do was wait. The officers, who had thought they were in control, were visibly sweating now, their eyes darting nervously toward the police cars that had just arrived, and the growing sense of unease was palpable. The air was thick with tension as the new officers, clearly senior to the ones who had originally detained her, arrived on the scene. They were briefed quickly, their expressions darkening as they understood the gravity of the situation. Lila's calmness only seemed to heighten their nervousness. They knew the power of the call she had made. They knew who she was, or at least they thought they did. In reality, Lila was no ordinary woman, and her connection to the highest levels of power wasn't just a coincidence. It was the culmination of years of careful planning, of building relationships in places most people couldn't even imagine. She wasn't just some random citizen. She was someone with a purpose, someone with influence, and the officers had just made the mistake of underestimating her. Back in the city, Marcus sat on the bus, the woman's note still tucked in his pocket. He kept taking it out, looking at it, trying to make sense of it. His mind was still buzzing from the encounter. How could something so small, a simple gesture of offering his seat, lead to this strange, unexplainable moment? He could feel the weight of the note, the message it carried, but he had no idea what it truly meant. He felt as if he was being pulled into something larger, something bigger than himself. He was just a teenager. What could he possibly do with a note like that? And who was the woman really? Was she just another stranger, or was there something more to her than met the eye? As the bus pulled up to a stop, Marcus hesitated before stepping off. His thoughts were consumed with the note. He could feel that it was important, that it was a key to something. But the more he thought about it, the more the world around him seemed to blur. It was like he had just crossed some invisible threshold, one that he couldn't go back from. The question lingered. What was the potential she saw in him? He didn't have the answers yet, but he was beginning to realize that his life was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Meanwhile, Lila's patience was beginning to fray as she waited for the inevitable. The officers were no longer questioning her. They were too busy receiving orders through their radios, their faces drained of any remaining confidence. They had tried to do things by the book, but in doing so, they had stepped into a trap they hadn't even known existed. And now, it wasn't just their careers that were at risk. It was something much bigger. Lila's phone buzzed in her pocket, a soft vibration that sent a chill down her spine. It was the confirmation she had been waiting for. The Pentagon had been alerted. There would be no easy way out for the officers now. It was too late to cover up their mistake. The power structures that had been put in place to protect certain people had just been called into question. There were far-reaching consequences waiting for them, and Lila was the one holding the key to unraveling everything. The tension in the air was electric as the backup officers began to speak more urgently, their words rushed and low. They exchanged glances, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. They were on the brink of something they didn't fully understand, something that was beyond their training and experience. Their sense of control had been shattered in a matter of moments, and now all they could do was watch as events spiraled beyond their grasp. For Lila, this moment had been a long time coming. She had worked in the shadows for years, gathering information, building alliances, learning how to maneuver through the complex systems that ran the country. She knew what it meant to be a woman of color in a world that often sought to silence voices like hers. But she had never allowed herself to be silenced. She had found ways to fight back, to make sure that the systems in power didn't control her narrative. And today, she was taking back that control, one phone call at a time. As the scene at the police stop unfolded, Lila could see that her plan was working. The officers were no longer sure of themselves. They were rattled, unsure of what to do next. But there was something else brewing beneath the surface, a larger conflict, one that had been building for years and had finally come to a head. The system wasn't just broken, it was being exposed, piece by piece, and Lila was in the middle of it all. Meanwhile, Marcus was beginning to feel the weight of his own decisions. The note in his pocket felt like a secret, one that he was too young to understand but too old to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that his simple act of kindness had set something into motion, something he had no control over. And yet, he was starting to sense that this was just the beginning of something far more significant than a mere gesture of politeness. He had been given a glimpse into a world that he never knew existed, one filled with power, influence, and connections that could change lives in an instant. As he walked home, his mind raced with possibilities. What if the woman had seen something in him? What if there was more to her than just a stranger on a bus? The note still burned a hole in his pocket, and he could feel his future shifting beneath his feet. The world was suddenly full of questions, and the answers were just out of reach. Lila's phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message this time, and when she read it, her heart skipped a beat. The message was brief, but it confirmed everything she had been hoping for. The cavalry was on its way. Her phone call had triggered a series of events that would soon make waves across the country. But there was something more she needed to do before it all went public. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not when everything was hanging by a thread. The stakes were too high. For both Lila and Marcus, the web they were caught in was growing tighter, pulling them into a conflict that neither of them fully understood. Their actions, small as they seemed in a moment, had set off a chain reaction that would soon alter the course of their lives forever. But the question remained, what would they do when the truth finally came to light? Would they be ready for what was to come? The tension in the air was palpable, so thick that it seemed to suffocate everything in its path. Lila sat still, her wrists aching from the handcuffs, but her mind was sharp and clear. She could hear the officers muttering among themselves, their words barely audible over the sound of the street. Their confusion was growing by the second. They had no idea what was happening, no idea what they had just set into motion. Lila's gaze drifted to the distant horizon, where she could feel the wheels of the world turning, slowly but surely, toward a moment of reckoning. She had made the call, but now the ball was in motion, and there was no turning back. The officers had lost their edge. They were looking over their shoulders, their radios crackling with static, but nothing was happening the way they had expected. The backup they called for wasn't arriving in the usual timely fashion. The delay was palpable, and with every passing minute, their confidence began to erode. They were no longer in charge of the situation. The fact that Lila was still sitting there, calm and composed, only made them more uneasy. The pressure was building, and no one knew what would come next. Back on the streets, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had spent the evening staring at the note, reading it over and over again, trying to piece together its meaning. It felt like a message, a warning, something bigger than he could understand. But no matter how many times he looked at it, it still didn't make sense. Who was this woman? Why had she given him the note? What did it mean when she said he wasn't alone? Every time he tried to distract himself, his mind kept returning to that single question. What was the potential she saw in him? He felt a sense of urgency now. Something was pulling him toward something, he just didn't know what. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut, something that told him he was meant to be part of something bigger. But what? The night had fallen, and the city seemed to pulse with energy. Lila's phone buzzed again, breaking through the haze of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. It was a brief message, one she had been waiting for, but now it felt different. The words sent a jolt through her body, a rush of adrenaline that quickened her pulse. It was a countdown. Everything is set.
Get ready.
She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. This was it, the final stage of her plan. The web she had carefully woven over the years, every thread leading to this moment, was about to snap into place. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something far bigger than any one person. The Pentagon's involvement was no small matter. It meant that what had started as an ordinary confrontation on the streets of the city had now escalated into a national incident. Lila wasn't just fighting for justice in her own name anymore. She was fighting for a cause much larger than herself. She had done everything she could to prepare for this moment, to make sure the system that had failed her and so many others would finally be held accountable. But as the minutes ticked down, She couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of doubt. Was she ready? Had she done enough? Was the truth going to be enough to change anything? She glanced up at the officers once more. They were nervously looking around, as if waiting for something to happen, but unsure of what. Their fear was becoming more apparent by the second. They had no idea how deep this went, no idea who they were really dealing with. Lila was no longer just a woman on the street. They had just stepped into a game they had no chance of winning. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder how far the fallout would reach. The system, the powers that be, they were always so careful, so protected. But everything had its breaking point. The question was, would this moment be that breaking point? Would Lila's actions spark the change she had been working toward, or would the system, as it always had, find a way to crush her and everyone who dared to challenge it? In the distance, a black car pulled up to the corner of the street. It was sleek and unmarked, blending into the night. But the moment Lila saw it, she knew. This was it. She had been waiting for this moment. The car stopped, and two men in suits stepped out. One of them nodded toward her, and without saying a word, they began to approach. Her heart raced. This was the cavalry. This was the moment when everything would change. The officers, realizing something was different, began to tense up. They exchanged hurried words, but no one moved. They didn't know who these men were, but they could tell they weren't ordinary civilians. The two men approached Lila, their presence commanding the street as though they owned it. One of them pulled out a phone and spoke in low tones. Lila watched them, feeling her resolve harden. This was her moment. The officers had no idea what was coming. They had no idea how much bigger this was than just an arrest. Back on the bus, Marcus had made his way home, the note still clutched in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The words haunted him. "You're not alone." What did that mean? He had to find out more. Something told him that this note, this simple act of kindness, was the key to something much larger than he could imagine. He felt as though he was on the edge of discovering something big, something that would change everything. But the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. What if the woman had known something about him? What if there was a reason she had singled him out? He felt as though he was standing on the precipice of something that could change not just his future, but the future of everyone around him. But what was that something? He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. Lila's heart raced as the men in suits stepped closer, their faces unreadable. The officers stood there, frozen, uncertain. They had no idea what was happening, and the confusion was written all over their faces. Lila knew that in just a matter of moments, everything would come to a head. The question was, who would be left standing when it was all over? The men in suits reached Lila, their footsteps heavy on the pavement as they stood before her. The air crackled with the tension of the moment. The officers, who had been holding their ground just seconds earlier, now seemed small, insignificant in the face of these new arrivals. The men exchanged a glance before one of them spoke, his voice low but carrying authority. "Miss Roberts," he said, his eyes scanning the officers. "We've been instructed to take over from here." The words hit the officers like a punch to the gut. They had expected backup, but not like this. Not this level of intervention. They hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, clearly unsure of what was happening, of how to proceed. The officer in charge stepped forward, his voice shaky, but still trying to maintain some form of authority. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What's going on here?" "We've got this under control." Lila didn't even look at him.
She didn't need to.
She knew the game was up. With a subtle nod, she gave the signal. The two men in suits stepped aside, allowing another figure to approach. This time, it was someone none of them had expected, a familiar face, someone the officers had never imagined would appear in this moment. It was a woman, tall, with short black hair, dressed in a sleek black jacket that didn't match the circumstances. She was carrying herself like someone used to being in charge. As she approached, her eyes met Lila's, and there was something in them. Something understanding, like they shared a secret the world didn't know. The officers didn't have a clue who she was, but Lila recognized her immediately. This woman wasn't just a government agent or some random bureaucrat. This woman was high up in the chain, Someone Lila had known for years, someone who had been instrumental in her quiet fight for justice. As the woman reached the center of the scene, she turned her gaze toward the officers, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. She raised her hand in a gesture that silenced the murmuring officers, and without a word, the tension between them was palpable. They all understood. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. This was a battle between systems, one that had been brewing beneath the surface for far too long. "I think it's time for a change," the woman said, her voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation at hand. "And it starts here." The officers' faces turned pale. They were no longer in control of the situation. They were now just spectators, caught in a whirlwind they hadn't seen coming. Lila looked up at the woman, her lips curling into a faint smile. This was it. The moment of reckoning was finally here. But then, just as Lila thought she could finally exhale, something unexpected happened. The woman pulled out her phone. She tapped a few commands, and the phone screen lit up with a message. Her expression faltered for just a split second, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the air. The officers, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, watched her closely, waiting for some kind of explanation. But the woman didn't look at them. Instead, she glanced at Lila, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Something's wrong," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. The tension in the air shifted once more. Lila felt it. She could see the change in the woman's demeanor, a shift that felt like the ground was crumbling beneath them. Whatever had been set in motion had just taken an unexpected turn. "What's going on?" Lila asked, her voice low but insistent. The woman looked at her, then back down at her phone, swiping through the information that was now flooding her screen. This isn't supposed to happen.
They knew about you."
They knew what was coming, but they didn't anticipate this. They didn't know who was really behind it. Lila's heart skipped a beat. They knew? Who? What was happening? She had thought she had everything under control, that the plan she had carefully crafted over the years was going to succeed, that the truth would finally come out. But now, everything was unraveling before her eyes. The officers were still standing there, frozen, but their eyes were filled with suspicion. They could tell something had shifted, something they didn't understand. They were no longer sure what game they were playing. But they didn't have time to question the new developments. The woman's voice cut through the stillness again, sharp and urgent. "Call them off," she said, looking directly at Lila.
"Now."
"The people you've been working with, they weren't supposed to be involved." Lila's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. She had known that her fight wasn't going to be easy, but now she was beginning to realize just how deep the corruption ran. The people she had trusted, the ones who had promised her that they were working for a better future, were not the ones pulling the strings. They had been puppets too, unknowingly part of a much larger game. Her stomach churned as she processed the magnitude of the situation. She had thought she was fighting the system, but what if the system was something entirely different than she had imagined? Before she could respond, the woman's phone buzzed once more, a loud vibration breaking through the silence. Her face paled even further, the color draining from her cheeks. "It's too late. They've already activated the backup." Lila's blood ran cold. Backup? Who was this they? The woman's words were not just a warning, they were a signal. Whatever had been set in motion, whatever had begun with Lila's single phone call, was escalating in ways that no one, not even the highest authorities, had anticipated. The officers, now looking at each other nervously, began to inch back, as though trying to distance themselves from the rapidly escalating situation. They could feel the ground beneath them shifting, and they knew that if they stayed in this moment much longer, they would be caught in the crossfire. And then, in the distance, the unmistakable sound of sirens began to wail, slowly growing louder. But these weren't just ordinary sirens. These were the kind of sirens that accompanied a storm, the kind of sound that sent chills down your spine, signaling that a force far greater than any of them was closing in. Lila knew they were coming. Whoever they were. She had no idea who her allies were anymore, and she wasn't sure who she could trust. But one thing was clear, everything was about to explode, and the fallout would be felt far beyond the street, this city, and perhaps even the entire country. Her heart raced, her hands clenched into fists. She could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure of the unknown building around her. Whatever happened next would change everything, and she had no idea whether it would be for better or for worse. But one thing was certain. The game had changed, and no one was prepared for what was coming next. The sirens grew louder, a deafening wail that pierced the air and signaled the arrival of whatever had been set in motion. Lila stood frozen, her mind racing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The officers were on edge, glancing over their shoulders, unsure of what to expect. The woman in black, still holding her phone, stared intently at the screen, her expression hardening as if she was receiving a command from somewhere far beyond this moment. Lila's heart hammered in her chest. The backup was arriving, but who would it be? And why did the woman look so shaken? Lila took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. The woman didn't answer immediately, her fingers scrolling through the screen, her brow furrowed. It was only when the sound of approaching vehicles grew closer that she looked up, her eyes meeting Lila's. "We've been misled," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The backup isn't coming to help. They're coming to silence everything." A chill ran down Lila's spine as the words settled in. Silence everything? What did that mean? Before she could speak, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, and from the vehicle, a group of armed men emerged. They were wearing tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks, and they moved swiftly, surrounding the officers who stood frozen in place. The officers, who had just moments ago been questioning the authority of Lila's situation, were now completely out of their depth. The presence of these new figures, the cold professionalism with which they moved, made it clear. This wasn't just a routine operation. This was something far more dangerous. Lila's gut tightened. She knew, in that instant, that this wasn't just about her anymore. The plan she had set in motion had triggered a series of events that were spiraling out of her control. But there was no turning back now. "Get in the car," the woman ordered, her voice stern, her gaze unyielding. Lila hesitated. She had expected resistance from the officers, maybe a fight to prove her innocence or challenge the authority of the system. But she hadn't expected this, the cold, calculated approach of these men. It was as if the system itself was mobilizing to crush any challenge to its power. "What do you mean, silence everything?" Lila asked again, more forcefully this time, trying to understand what she had just been told. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed Lila's arm and led her toward the SUV. The noise of the approaching sirens grew louder, and for a moment, Lila thought she saw a flash of fear in the woman's eyes. It was brief, but unmistakable. "Just trust me," the woman muttered, pulling Lila into the vehicle. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the car sped off, the tires screeching against the pavement. Lila's mind raced as she stared at the woman, waiting for answers, but the woman remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. As the car weaved through the city streets, Lila glanced back through the rear window, seeing the officers and the armed men behind them fading into the distance. But the more she tried to piece together what had just happened, the more questions piled up. Who were these men? Why had they appeared so suddenly? And what had the woman meant when she said they were there to silence everything? Finally, the woman spoke, her voice laced with urgency. "Lila, there's no time to explain everything now. But you need to know this. What you set in motion was bigger than just you. The people you've been working with, the ones you thought you could trust, they've been playing both sides. This isn't just a fight for justice. This is a fight for control." Lila's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" The woman met her gaze, her expression hardened. "They used you, and they're going to make sure you're not in a position to expose what's really going on." Lila's mind spun as the truth began to dawn on her. The system, the people she had trusted, had been lying all along. Everything she had fought for, the arrests, the calls, the information, had all been manipulated, twisted to serve the interests of those who controlled the power. The same system she thought she was bringing down was now turning its machinery against her. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a game far larger than she could have ever imagined. "Why should I trust you?" Lila demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. "How do I know you're not just another part of the system?" The woman didn't flinch. "You don't. But right now, you don't have a choice." The car swerved sharply, taking a turn that sent Lila's stomach into her throat. She had no idea where they were headed, but the sense of impending danger was suffocating. And then it happened. The car screeched to a halt in front of an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The woman turned to Lila, her eyes locked onto hers with a steely intensity. "Get out.
Now."
Lila didn't argue. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from everything as possible. But she stayed, her curiosity pushing her forward. As they stepped out of the car, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The woman led Lila inside, through a heavy metal door that creaked as it opened. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and machinery. But what stood out most was the large projector screen at the far end of the room, flickering to life as they entered. The woman turned to Lila, her face tense. "This is where the truth will come out. But it's not going to be pretty." Before Lila could ask what she meant, the screen lit up, revealing a series of files. Confidential, heavily redacted documents. They were full of names, dates, and locations, details that Lila immediately recognized. These weren't just random pieces of information. They were the very files she had been working with, the ones that had been leaked to her. But there was something wrong. The documents didn't match up. They were incomplete, altered in ways that only someone deeply involved in the system could have done. The woman stepped forward, her finger pointing at a particular file. "This is the final piece you didn't know about. You've been fed half-truths. The real ones pulling the strings, the ones who've been behind this whole operation, are the very people you thought were on your side." Lila's breath caught in her throat as the truth hit her like a freight train. The people she had trusted, the ones she had been working with, had manipulated her from the start. The files she had uncovered, the calls she had made, all of it, it had been a setup, a carefully orchestrated plan to draw her in, to make her the scapegoat in a game she didn't even know existed. And just as the realization began to sink in, the woman turned to her, her eyes burning with a quiet fury. "It's not over yet, but the game's just changed. You need to decide what side you're on because there's no turning back now." Lila looked at the files on the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. Her entire world was crumbling around her, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders. This fight was far from over, and now, more than ever, she understood the stakes. The world was watching, and she was no longer just a pawn. She was in the game, and the final move was up to her. Lila stood still, her mind spinning with the weight of everything she had just uncovered. The files on the screen in front of her seemed to mock her, each page revealing more than she had ever anticipated. The woman who had led her here was watching her closely, her arms crossed, waiting for Lila to make the next move. Lila felt a surge of anger and frustration rise in her chest. How had she been so blind? The people she thought she was fighting for had been using her from the start, playing her like a pawn in a much larger game. It was almost too much to comprehend. Yet, as she stood there in the dim light of the warehouse, something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to let them win. She couldn't. The woman stepped closer, her voice low and serious. "You're not alone in this, Lila. But you need to act fast. The people behind all of this are too powerful to be stopped by just one person. You need to expose them, but you won't be able to do it alone." Lila's mind raced. She had already exposed so much, but this was bigger than anything she could have imagined. If she went public with the files, if she leaked the truth about the people who had been controlling everything from behind the scenes, she would be risking everything. Her freedom, her life. But in that moment, she realized there was no other choice. She couldn't stand by and let this corruption continue. Not after everything she had learned. "I'm in," Lila said, her voice firm. "But how do we make sure they don't silence us?" The woman nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "That's where we come in. We've already made preparations. We've got the media on our side, and we've got allies in high places. But it all starts with you." Lila felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. There were people out there who cared, who were willing to fight alongside her. The weight on her shoulders didn't seem so heavy anymore. Together, they worked quickly, making sure the files were safely transferred to a secure location. They sent the documents to trusted journalists, people who had the power to bring the truth to light. It wasn't long before the world started to take notice. The media began reporting on the corruption that had infiltrated every corner of society, and slowly, the walls that had once kept the truth hidden began to crumble. But even as the world started to wake up to the reality of what had been happening, Lila knew there was still a long road ahead. The battle wasn't over. There were still powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But for the first time, Lila felt hopeful. She had exposed the truth, and now there was no going back. As the news spread, the ripple effect was felt far and wide. People began to question everything, what they had been told, who they had trusted. The system they had blindly followed was no longer invincible. The world had changed, and it was only the beginning. But Lila knew there would be consequences. There were still those who would try to silence her, to stop her from sharing what she had uncovered. The woman, now revealed as a key player in a covert operation to dismantle the corruption from within, kept in contact with Lila, offering guidance and protection when needed. They worked together, navigating the complex web of power and deception that had kept the truth buried for so long. But as Lila saw the public's reaction, the protests, the calls for justice, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her decision had changed everything. The fight was no longer about just one person's story. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, about every injustice that had been swept under the rug for far too long. The victory was sweet, but Lila knew it was just the beginning. Months later, as Lila watched the news reports and the testimonies of those who had stood up in solidarity with her, she felt a bittersweet satisfaction. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles left to fight. But the world had been shaken, and the truth was out. The key takeaway from everything that had unfolded was clear. No matter how powerful the system seemed, no matter how entrenched the corruption appeared to be, one voice could make a difference. Lila had proven that, and her story would inspire countless others to stand up, to fight for what was right, and to never stop pushing for justice, no matter the cost. In the end, Lila realized that this journey had not just been about exposing the truth. It had been about rediscovering her own strength, her own voice. It had been about taking back control from a system that had tried to break her. As the sun set on a new chapter in her life, Lila stood tall, knowing that the fight for truth and justice would continue, but she was no longer alone. She had allies. She had strength. And most importantly, she had the power of truth on her side. The final twist had revealed itself not in a dramatic confrontation or a last-minute escape, but in the quiet, steadfast realization that no matter how dark the path, no matter how impossible the odds, one person could ignite a movement that would change the world forever. And with that, Lila smiled, knowing that she had done what she set out to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every truth that had been buried. The story was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning.